As the latest conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues to escalate, new reports have revealed staggering losses on both sides. The devastating toll of the conflict has left many wondering what the endgame of this deadly game of brinksmanship will look like. With tensions at an all-time high, the future of the region hangs in the balance, and the world watches with bated breath to see what will happen next. Let us further explore the latest Russian and Ukraine war losses revealed and the prediction of what the end of the war will look like. The war in Ukraine was ongoing and had been ongoing since 2014. The conflict began when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, and separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine declared independence with Russian support. The war has resulted in thousands of deaths and displacement of civilians. Efforts to resolve the conflict have been ongoing, including ceasefire agreements and peace talks. However, violence and fighting have continued, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The situation in Ukraine remains tense and volatile, with the potential for further escalation. The involvement of Russia and the ongoing geopolitical tensions between Russia and the West continue to complicate efforts to reach a resolution. The FSB's claimed estimate of almost 110,000 casualties by February is still far less than those revealed this week in previously released U.S. documents, which put the country's losses at between 189,500 and 223,000 casualties, including 35,500 to 43,000 personnel killed in action. War map analysis. Before dawn on February 24, 2022, Russia launched dozens of missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. Russian ground forces entered the country fast and took over a sizable portion of Ukraine within a few weeks. They had reached the outskirts of Kyiv and were in complete control of Sumy and the majority of the country's northeast. Russian soldiers were encircling the port city of Mariupol while shelling Kharkiv and capturing land as far as Kherson in the east and south. However, they encountered fierce Ukrainian resistance almost everywhere. They encountered significant logistical challenges due to the poorly motivated Russian troops who were experiencing a lack of food, water, and ammunition. The NLAW anti-tank system, which the Ukrainian troops quickly deployed after receiving it from the West, proved to be quite successful against the Russian advance. After more Western weapons were added, the situation drastically changed by October. After failing to capture Kyiv, Russia withdrew entirely from the north. Ukraine achieved its first significant victory by pushing Russia away from Kharkiv and launching a counterattack around Kherson. 1 year after the invasion, Ukraine controls Kherson. For the time being, it has largely stopped Russia's progress in the east. The conflict in Ukraine may drag on for months or possibly years without any major operations being carried out by either side. It has been a horrible tragedy for Ukraine and Ukrainians to be involved in this war, or this most recent chapter of a conflict that started in 2014 with the illegal invasion of Crimea by Russian troops. Thousands of civilians, including tens of thousands, have perished. 13 million people have fled their homes as a result of the violence, either becoming refugees abroad or being internally displaced within Ukraine. The financial cost of the destruction to industry, homes, and infrastructure is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, Russia has suffered greatly as a result of the war that Vladimir Putin started. Officials from the West believe that the Russian military has lost around 200,000 soldiers to combat-related injuries. Western sanctions have hurt Russia's economy, though not to the extent that was expected. With Finland and Sweden abandoning decades of neutrality to pursue membership in NATO, and Berlin renouncing 5 decades of German policy towards the Soviet Union and Russia, Europe has come together in favor of Ukraine. Russia will be less powerful after the conflict in terms of its military, economy, and geopolitics. First, Ukraine's will to resist is vastly underrated by the Kremlin. This conflict is seen as essential by Ukrainians. If they lose, both their democracy and the goal of becoming a typical European nation, which inspires many young people, will be lost. Additionally, Ukrainians have witnessed what Russian occupation means in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and many other cities and towns. I chatted with a former Ukrainian co-worker a few weeks ago at the American Embassy in Kyiv. Living with intermittent electricity, limited heat, and frequent air raid alarms is difficult. She was adamant, "This is our land, and we will fight for it." Second, several Americans and Europeans appear to be unaware of the causes of the war and have accepted the Kremlin's claim that NATO expansion was to blame. That cannot withstand careful examination. It makes sense that the Kyiv government would want to join NATO, given Russian aggressiveness over the previous 9 years. However, the NATO membership of Ukraine requires unanimous approval from all of the alliance's members and does not enjoy widespread support. Many allies are still reluctant to declare war on Russia on behalf of Ukraine at this time. In Moscow, everyone was afraid of that. When Mr. Putin told the media in June of last year that there is nothing to worry us in terms of Swedish and Finnish membership of NATO, it's hard to believe that the Kremlin was so deeply concerned about the alliance's enlargement. Predictions are challenging. Few observers in the West, and presumably none in the Kremlin, predicted that the Ukrainian military would mostly be able to hold its own in February 2023, a year ago. Stanford professor Stephen Pfeiffer outlines what Russia aims to accomplish and why its policies towards Ukraine are failing as Russia raises its military presence along the Ukrainian border. Despite this, it's apparent that Russia cannot win this war in the sense of accomplishing its initial objectives. According to the multi-pronged attack on Ukraine a year ago, the Kremlin wanted to seize Kyiv and occupy the eastern half to 2/3 of the country. Few reputable military analysts think that is currently possible for the Russian military. Whatever the outcome of the war, a Ukrainian state that is independent and sovereign will remain on the continent of Europe. It will be far larger than the rump state that Moscow ostensibly meant to abandon a year ago. In the first 4 months of 2023, Ukrainian forces achieved notable victories, driving Russian soldiers from the Kharkiv region and forcing them back across the Dnipro River in Kherson. When the winter thaw and mud season are over, will the Ukrainian military expand on that with additional counteroffensives, likely in the spring? The Russian army has constructed defensive positions, so it will be difficult to entirely drive them out of Ukraine, even though they appear capable of liberating more occupied land. Because neither side is capable of carrying out a decisive operation to end the war, the American intelligence community has determined that an attrition war is the most likely scenario. That might go on for weeks, perhaps years. When the parties tire themselves to the point where a discussion is possible, then it may become the question. Moscow, though, has not exhibited any serious willingness to negotiate so far. At the same time that its army was losing ground on the battlefield, the Russian leadership increased its demands of Kyiv. What will it take to end the war in Ukraine? One side or the other must achieve a clear victory, or peace talks must begin. Moscow has made expectations that it must be aware are impossible to fulfill. Early in March 2022, the Ukrainians proposed to accept neutrality as part of negotiations to terminate the conflict. Later in March, though, as large-scale Russian atrocities were exposed to the liberation of towns like Bucha and Irpin, the Ukrainian government's stance became more rigid. The government's stance is not the only thing that has become more rigid. Polls show that a sizable majority of Ukrainians support fighting to the death and are opposed to dialogue. Long wars are not advantageous for Ukraine, and it may be difficult for the West to maintain public support for the long-term aid that Ukraine needs. Since the Kremlin's calculations may change, I think the West should give Ukraine a significant military support right away, allowing the Ukrainian military to either drive the Russians out or, at the very least, make enough battlefield progress for Moscow to begin negotiating a settlement on terms that Kyiv can accept. Even with such a deal, Ukraine would still have to deal with a hostile Russian neighbor. The West would have to assist Kyiv in maintaining a strong, modernized military that's capable of thwarting a future Russian invasion. Hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you next time.